Thank you for such a nice gathering here, and we are talking about nature. We are talking about value of natural assets. Sitting in the most biodiverse ecosystem of the world, in the eastern India, in Guwahati. So if we see like many of the businesses, it's fine. Yeah. So many businesses for decades have neglected the value of nature and as a larger denominator of success in terms of businesses. But now, because of the lots of different movements which are happening across the world, with ESG, SDG, lots of other movements from the civil sector society at the same time, lots of different entities which are coming up in terms of finding some alternates, in terms of giving some solutions which could be harnessing the best of the nature, but at the same time valuing the nature in a different way is coming up. So with this whole thing, we are coming up with something called Nature Index, which is a very unique concept, where we are talking about a revolutionary approach in championing the economic value of nature. At the same time, we are also talking about a tangible economic value to the biodiversity and natural assets as well. And with that context, we have an esteemed panel of guests here, and we will be pondering upon how to kind of find a larger intersection of the corporate good, which we are talking about, the interests of theirs, at the same time, how to find a way where we have more equitable society coming in together as well. To coming up, like I'll start with Shashi. Like here, hi Shashi. You have been in the you have been wearing different heads. Obviously, you are Chief Sustainability Officer of HUL, but you also have a very keen interest in wildlife, and you have seen India in a very different way, talking about different things. So how HUL has been like overall transforming this whole sustainability movement in India and across the world. When we're talking about, you have a very strong influence in terms of various communities and how the whole ecosystem can go to the next level. At the same time, you have a very big platform where you have a different intersectionality of policies and standardization of different aspects as well. So how you are designing these policy frameworks that can empower local economies and also build the climate resilience, especially with Himalayan northeastern ecosystem.
Thank you very much. Ranjit, the entire team of Balipara, firstly, congratulations on putting this together, and thank you for having me here. From a very long time, I think for HUL, it's going to be 10 decades now, a 100-year-old company, and we've always believed in making sustainable living a commonplace, and also a very strong belief that what is good for India is good for HUL. And if you look at that, then all the products that we build, we believe that it should empower the lives of people and make them better. If you look at it, then the entire sustainability strategy is built on 4 pillars, which is climate, nature, plastics, and livelihood. And the third pole, and what we're discussing today, the significance of it, sits very aptly in terms of the way corporates also look at their goals, the way we look at our goals. Climate change is for real, we all understand it. But what is important is what role do we as corporates play in this entire ecosystem. So if you look at a demonstrator, a thought leader, and a catalyzer, so corporates like us coming together will create very apt dialogue on issues, and that dialogue will foster action. Of course, in sustainability, what is important is that action is like should have been done 10 years ago. Okay, but it still has a long way to go looking at the maturity. So from an advocacy standpoint, we work on a number of things. For example, if we look at plastics, the biggest problem which is there. We look at plastics and waste under the Swachh Bharat mission. And if you look at the Swachh Bharat mission, it talks about waste to wealth. So there is waste which is generated by people. So I can categorize waste into this entire value chain into three buckets. The first one is the consumer end, and that is where we need responsible consumerism. And if the Mission Life program by the Honorable Prime Minister, it talks about not creating demand for products which will turn into waste very quickly. So how do we educate consumers into being mindful of not buying things which will turn into waste? That's the responsible citizenship part. Then segregating it at home. The second important part is the waste workers, so social inclusion, giving them a job identity. And of course the last one is connecting it to recycling infrastructure, whether mechanical or chemical recycling. And this is just one example of how the advocacy is created. If you get into regenerative agriculture, so then coalitions which will work towards the future of tea in Assam, we work with Trustee, TRA, etc. And there have been studies which show the climatic impact of tea and how it's going to change by 2050. So how do you work with smallholders? And of course, 50% of Assam's tea is smallholders. And how do you work with them to get into a better non-pesticide, non-climate impacted tea growing? So I'm just taking the case of tea, but there is sustainable sourcing for a whole lot of crops which are in our category. And of course, water is a very big aspect of it. And if you look at it, it's like 3.2 trillion liters of water that we created through just working with communities across the country. The number is not important. What is important is the entire education that is needed, working with agri communities in terms of everyone understanding the importance of this natural resource, and then mitigating the long-term impacts to it. So these are the ways which advocacy, participation, collaboration can actually take.
Thanks. Spencer, I'll come to you. It was very interesting to know that you've seen India up and close. You've been to Ladakh when everything was super different than what it is today. Glaciers were still intact. The biodiversity was still very vibrant. So I'll come into this whole paradigm shift that we are seeing with the development sector on the other side, one side, and the corporate interest on the other side. So with Asia being home to so much of vulnerable communities to climate change, how is Google collaborating with grassroots organizations, government and indigenous communities to build resilience, especially if we talk about the indigenous communities across this northeast, which is very, very unique to the world. At the same time, can you share some examples that take solutions that Google is coming up with for these ecosystems to thrive and conserve without disturbing the indigenous way of life as well? Yeah.
Thank you, Anuj, for that great question. And first of all, huge congratulations to the Balipara Foundation for this wonderful summit. The president of Asia Pacific for Google, Mr. Sanjay Gupta, is a big supporter of Balipara Foundation, and unfortunately he couldn't be here today. But to pick up on your question, first I'd like to say that for Google, sustainability is a really core part of our engagement with the communities that we serve. And we look at it in two parts. First, our products, as well as our operations. And under our operations, one of the four pillars is the topic of biodiversity, which we take very seriously. But of course, it is through our products, which are used by billions of people every day around the world, that we think we can have a really big impact. So the first answer to your question is that Google, we have a lot of technology, we have a lot of data, but we don't have all the levers. We need partnerships and collaborations to make an impact at the local level. As you said, we have to enable the grassroots. So I think a number of ways in which we do that is one, through the use of satellite imagery. So we're working on various products that we make available to NGOs and researchers so that they can actually have up-to-date information on what's going on the ground from higher. But we do need to calibrate all that information with people on the ground, because you always need the on-the-ground verification, because satellite imagery needs to be calibrated, etc. And so that's one kind of collaboration that we're working on around the world, and certainly for APAC, we're looking at opportunities to strengthen that in the third pole. Another way that we're helping is, in fact, the importance of indigenous communities. And we've learned, especially through generative AI, that the whole world doesn't speak English. And so you need to be able to reach people in their local languages. And I'm glad to share that we just did a search while we were speaking. And Google has translation models. So these are the basis of large language models that can be adapted for use through APIs by startups and NGOs that covers some of the important languages in the Northeast. Nepali, of course, Assamese, but also some that I learned about today, which are Mizo and Khasi and Meitei. So these are languages that are not very commonly spoken outside of the region, but yet they provide the key in terms of the ability to reach the communities that are frontline communities and have the wisdom and the knowledge of the local traditions and local conditions, and that's what Google is hoping to be able to build on, working with partners. Thank you.
Thanks. So, Rushdie, I wanted to come back to you. You have been at the forefront of a big social movement as a person, obviously as a bank, and HDFC Bank has been across the Northeast, which is many of the people will say that they have not been present, but you all have taken a conscious effort to be in the Northeast, to the Himalayas, and so on and so forth. So keeping that in mind, I wanted to understand the larger philosophy where how does HDFC Bank incorporate the biodiversity conservation, especially in places like Northeast, with a gender lens into its CSR strategy? And can you share some specific projects or initiative where HDFC has been actively working to protect and enhance the biodiversity, keeping in lens the Northeast? Yeah.
Thank you so much for that question, Anuj, and again, can't start without thanking the Balipara Foundation and Ranjit for having me here. It's been an honor. While my colleagues spoke about sustainability, I will address this from the lens of CSR. I think Shashidhar spoke about action, and that for us is the core for CSR. Way back in 2014, HDFC Bank incorporated sustainability as the fifth value. We've had 4 since inception. And when we took on sustainability and we had a board level committee that looked at CSR and sustainability, I think that was extremely important for us. It's given us an opportunity to look at both the issues internal and external from a sustainability lens and incorporate that into the CSR planning. And that, to my mind, has actually set the foundation for us looking at various projects from a sustainability perspective, from a biodiversity perspective, and respecting nature in general. We've got multiple projects pan-India, and we have a substantial presence in the Northeast itself. While we've got over about 21 programs running pan-India, specifically on watershed, where we're looking at ecological conservation, we're looking at soil and water restoration. The examples that I'll probably put up will be more regional because we are here in Guwahati and we're talking at a summit when we are addressing issues of the Himalayan region. I think rather than talking about a particular project, it's about how you basically interweave aspects of sustainability, respect for the environment, the ecological conservation into each and every program that you plan. And I think that is the key, instead of having a standalone flagship project that one can actually demonstrate as a commitment to a particular cause. Livelihood remains the source or the key that we address through multiple programs, whether it's skilling, whether it's rural development. Our objective is to look at economic activation in the communities. But while we do this, we look at it from a lens of sustainability, and that's how the programs are planned. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We work in the Himachals, and in Himachal, when we're talking about creating economic activity for women's groups, specifically on honey and beekeeping, we've actually worked with them to create an atmosphere or create the necessary flora and fauna around the natural habitat for the native species, and created mud houses or mud hives where they can actually pollinate and work on that. So the idea is not to disrupt the natural habitat, but see how we can actually integrate within the habitat. In Assam itself, we are working with more than, I think Azad also mentioned, we are working with weavers. We have about 200 plus women who are working on weaving, and we're talking about sustainable weaving. So right from dyeing to the both downstream and upstream linkage, we are looking at local indigenous products and how we can look at optimizing energy from a solar perspective. So these are some of the projects that will that really work. Again, as a small example of how one can actually consider these in planning, in Tamil Nadu, we have a program that we were working on where we had this typical human-animal conflict, and the farmers really spoke about how, the animals would disrupt their crops, etc. And our partner, of course, because we don't work directly, came up with this wonderful solution where they created these water bodies around these villages because the animals were coming there for water. And that drastically reduced the influx of animals into their fields. So I think simple solutions like this, where you are respecting each other, does substantially lead to a lot of change and, creating these boundaries and living, cohabitating peacefully. Another, and if I have the time, I'd like to talk about another one program that we do, which is in Ladakh, where we've created artificial glaciers, because we work a lot on water conservation. So while in Maharashtra it may be rejuvenating ponds, we've also worked in areas such as Leh and Ladakh, where we've created these artificial glaciers to see how we can actually ensure that the villages downstream have a steady supply of water, both for their consumption as well as for their agricultural and irrigation. So that's really the gamut of programs that we've got. One of the large programs that we do with Development Alternatives, which is also in the audience, is a program of local activation where we are working in close to about 12 states. And the idea is to work with women's groups, creating, identifying a crop, a region, and creating a nice market or a value chain for those crops. Again, with complete year on ground to understand what are the needs of the society, what is it that they are already working in, giving them the necessary training and the hand-holding support to bring them a notch up. So that's really a gamut of activities that we're doing. Anuj, I hope that sort of answers.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you spoke about artificial glacier. So we have a portfolio company in Ladakh and we have invested in them. One of the world's first for-profit artificial glacier startup. So great. So I go to Abhijit. You have a very unique role. You are both head of sustainability and CSR. You have a very unique interest in education, larger ecosystem building as well. And Axis Bank is the forefront of the whole movement in Orissa and many other developing states. So how do you see this whole paradigm shift in terms of the thing when we are talking about the rising demand for transparent ESG data? At the same time, how Axis Bank is balancing the push for sustainability with the pressure of financial performance, at the same time disclosures, and also the larger, I will say, the mission of Axis Bank as a sustainable bank. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here. Kudos to Balipara for such a wonderful event, and pleasure to share the stage with such a wonderful people. So I'm from Axis Bank, and I think I'll probably slightly shift in the narrative and the conversation, move away from CSR and put on my ESG hat, like Anuj rightly said. So at Axis, both of these are board level agendas. ESG, we have an ESG committee of the board, a standalone ESG committee, and the CSR committee of the board. And I just want to add one point. So while I was hearing Mr. speak, I was also pleased that it was validating a lot of the things that we are doing, what she said. So it's good. And that's where I want to start with. I want to touch upon that point also about collaboration. And I think Shashi, you also spoke about how collaboration is such an important aspect in everything that we're doing. Because one of the aspects that generally corporate sector and stakeholders don't seem to realize is that everything's interconnected so far. And I think when it especially comes to biodiversity and its role in the larger corporate action, how does it impact the bottom line? How does it impact your profits? I think it's coming from an era of abundance, and I think the corporate sector still has that kind of a thought that resources are infinite. I just need to mine more. I can build an EV. I can mine more. Basically, resources are all there to be converted into a product, and then that's how the economic cycle has been. So when it comes to Axis, I think 2-3 things I just want to highlight, and especially when it comes to ESG. So one of the biggest priorities for us over the last few years really has been around risk. As a financial institution, risk naturally is a very, very important part of our decision making. It's a very, very important aspect of how we decide where to lend. And really, over the last few years, we've recognized that while our banks, the risk systems that are in place, they are not really up to speed with the kind of risks that we see today. Climate risk, for example, biodiversity risk, for example, social risks, for example. They are vastly different today than they were perhaps 20, 30, 40 years ago when all of these risk models were being built. So the last few years, what we have done is put a lot of effort into strengthening our climate risk / ESG risk. That's another thing that we learned, we recognized that ESG risk is not the same as climate risk, for example, and it's not the same as biodiversity risk. So at that level of understanding, so right from enterprise level, we've been able to protect our entire balance sheet, to a portfolio level, we're looking at specific sectors, even to a project level. So those are the kind of levers we're trying to put in, because what we recognize is, and also this is a conversation that we often have, is that it's not just about doing small pockets of good things, but it's ultimately how do you move your entire portfolio towards better, so that it's more sustainable, it's more equitable, it's more inclusive. And I think really that's the kind of movement we're trying to make. On the biodiversity bit, so when I mentioned about talking about risk, and lastly I just want to add, so even at a project level, we apply what is called the IFC performance standards. We have one policy, it's been there for almost a decade, and HDFC also has one. So it is where what I was mentioning to you about, that we don't look at simply a project that if it's a renewable energy project, it's a good project. The aim is that even if you're funding the real economy, and I want to add here that funding the real economy is still very much an important part of this economy, it's needed. So we apply all these lenses there. Water, for example, water risk was perhaps 20, 30 years ago, it was not spoken of. Now it is well recognized there is a water risk. When you fund a thermal power project, for example, I know thermal power is also on its downshift for its own reasons, but water becomes a factor. Every greenfield project, for example, it gets assessed on its biodiversity risks. It gets assessed on its community risks. On all of those aspects get factored into decision making. These are some of the ways in which.
So I'll kind of little bit deep dive into the topic, and also kind of try to ponder upon 3 basic things that we all feel are very, very normalized. But if we see at a larger biodiversity level, it becomes very crucial. Fresh food, fresh water, and fresh air. So keeping that into mind, especially if I go back, in many regions, especially in rural and underserved communities, like if we talk about, the effect of climate change are disproportionately felt. Like if I'm sitting in Bombay, I may not feel because I get 24 hours water, electricity. At the same time, nearby villages may not have the similar luxury, in spite of the fact that the natural resources are harnessed from them. So as HUL, since you have a very big power in the overall ecosystem, how you use the advocacy power to push for the inclusive climate action plan, and also ensuring that local enterprise and marginalized communities have a seat at the table in shaping sustainability policies and practices.
So one of the very important things in the transition process is if you were to transition materials, knowledge, and mindset. Okay, if you look at this as a chain, low GHG products or ingredients. If you look at any manufacturing setup, ingredients will be roughly about 50% of the entire footprint. So you may get very low carbon products, but the ecosystem may not be ready. Or you may have people who do not know how to create products. So you will have a knowledge and both the mindset and the material problem which is there. And the last one is if both exist, then they may not have the intent to go there because of cost or because of many or effort or many other aspects to it. So from an advocacy standpoint, what remains very important for us is to transition all three. If we have to look at low GHG soda ash, in fact we've created the world's first low GHG soda ash. Okay, and that's about 70% lower than 60 to 70% lower than any other soda ash which is used as an ingredient. But you need to then work with the supplier ecosystem. You need to fight costs because that's a very big consideration for a business. Then you also need to get into consumer education. And that is where the entire policy transformation also needs to come in. And when we work with the government, like we've got a very strong partnership with MOFCC, with UNDP, etc. on aspects which I spoke about, mission life, for example. So all these things which will take you to responsible consumerism is very important so that everything trickles down to the producer and the consumer ecosystem. So there are people who are coming out with a whole lot of solutions, sustainable solutions on ground. But then there are startups like, startups which get funded by you, by corporates, and through CSR programs, through incubators, through accelerators. So all that leads to action, which even Nusrat was talking about. But policy needs to really pave the way. So the government's BioE3 policy, or you look at all the policies under Viksit Bharat, whatever is coming in, all that will pave a very strong way towards giving producers, people who understand what are the products of the future, a seat at the table. So that's one part of it from a transition standpoint. The other very important aspect is working in the solutions ecosystem. Incubators and accelerators have a very, very important role to play. So if you take, for example, recycling. So there is mechanical recycling. Mechanical recycling is where plastic doesn't change its form. Chemical is where it goes back to its original form. Chemical recycling only exists in lab environments. It doesn't have large-scale things. If you look at agri-tech innovations, they are all available by many great minds. Some of you who are already there in this room. But how do you take it to a scale-up? You need funding, you need aggregators. So all that is where again policy comes in, and organizations like us in this entire group play a very catalytic role to enable this transition.
So Spencer, I'll go ahead with a little bit of a more larger question about, we have lots of energy demands across as we are shaping up into the AI world and other things. Google was on track of meeting all the climate related, I will say, parameters, and suddenly AI came and bulldozed the whole thing. And you will have to reconcile and readjust with respect to the ferocious demand of artificial intelligence, how it is there. And if I take the context of the larger thing like hydrocarbon projects, lots of them are in the Himalayan region, but majority of times the electricity is not for the locals, it goes somewhere else. So keeping in mind that one AI related tweet or search can light up multiple villages for many months. How you are seeing Google reconciling the fact that this will affect the climate change larger goals for all of us?
Thank you for asking a very topical question that is on the minds of all the tech companies, certainly those involved in the very rapid development in artificial intelligence right now. You're absolutely right, AI runs on data centers. Data centers need electricity. And so at Google, we're very, very mindful of the impact of that. And so the rise of AI has certainly made our goals more challenging, but we've had deep conversations from the board level down to the C-suite, and everyone is still committed to the goal, which is to hit net zero by 2030, and to do so by reducing our carbon footprint by half from the 2019 baseline. But that said, some of you may have read the headlines that instead of reducing our carbon emissions, they have actually gone up since 2019, because partly there was the pandemic, but also because of the rise of artificial intelligence. That said, the increase has been a much smaller percentage of the huge increase in the amount of compute, just to use a technical term, that has actually happened, partly from just more people joining the internet during the pandemic years, but also with the rise of AI. So in a way, we are bending that curve through just sheer efficiency from hardware to operations. But where we look at building out new data centers now, there is a philosophy of energy first. Where do you put your data centers really depends on where you can have a pathway to 100% carbon-free energy 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because that's our goal by 2030. And so there are certain trade-offs. There are certain locations that are no longer attractive for data centers, and others that could develop. And certainly in this part of the world, the Himalayas, there are Bhutan, for example, is trying to attract more investment in terms of data centers because they are actually already running on 100% renewable energy thanks to hydropower. We have making more use of our data centers in Norway, for example, because they are also very, very high and over 90% renewable energy. So these are some of the ways in which we're trying to manage the impact. But that said, we have to also realize that not all renewable energy is necessarily good for the natural environment, even if they're quote unquote renewable. There's a debate around nuclear, which is probably worth another panel discussion. But certainly, if you look at hydropower, if hydropower is not done correctly, the projects are not well planned, they can have a huge impact on natural assets, biodiversity in the areas. And is that the right trade-off? Again, we want to be very careful, and certainly I'm sure my colleagues from fellow panelists from the banks are also very careful, I should say, in terms of how we look at investing or financing some of these projects, being really mindful, as I said, of the impact of biodiversity in the local environment, and also the impact of indigenous communities.
Thanks. And this is also pertinent because if you see in Himalaya, the phenomenon of bluff is also very normalized now. That also means hydroelectric projects will be having some effect in a big way. So we need to rethink also the way the development and energy harnessing should be done. So coming back to Nusrat, what do you see the biggest challenge and opportunities for SDFC and other businesses in integrating biodiversity into home practices? That's one. And how the financial institution like SDFC balance economic growth with the urgent need of environmental preservation for Himalaya and modernization unique and fragile biodiversity. Because for us, like people at large here, it's a very pertinent question that we want to ask. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So one would look at both the opportunities and the challenges from a lens of the organization, CSR in particular. While the opportunities, of course, are evident, you're looking at more efficient systems, you're looking at savings in terms of whether it's your energy, your waste reduction, etc. You're looking at a reputation from a brand perspective. I think the challenges in incorporating biodiversity and ecology in the overall plan. One is the complexity and the actual measurement of impact, right? Unfortunately, when one is looking at it from a CSR lens, everything that you do boils down to impact, outcomes. We like to have everything very organized into buckets, very streamlined. That doesn't really happen when you're looking at biodiversity, right? I mean, these are all long-term objectives that one's looking at. You've got to give it time. There are a lot of uncertainties around, how the projects will develop, how things plan out, because, these events can't be planned. There are a lot of dependencies on the entire ecosystem. So I think that does become a challenge in incorporating these aspects into planning when one is talking about projects, in particular in CSR. The way we look at it from a CSR perspective is we generally, and you'll see most of our projects that we do, we like to address the issues of whether it's biodiversity and looking at creating sustainable systems to something which is more tangible, and that brings us to livelihood. So, say for example, if I'm talking about projects in Sundarbans where we are working, on mangroves, we've got women self-help groups that we've established there, which actually go out, collect the seeds, create their nurseries, and then do the plantation. So you're actually creating some sort of a skilling for them, and you are also, working in a very fragile ecosystem there. Similarly, other projects like if I'm talking closer home, in Assam, we've got a project that you're aware of, which we're working with IIT Guwahati, on this entire program on agri world technology, where we are actually looking at creating or generating both solar energy as well as providing livelihoods to women. So you're looking at maximizing land, you're looking at creating energy out of that, and you're also creating value for the community there. So what we are doing is basically we've got about a 50-watt plant there which generates the energy. We've got women's group which working on sustainable tea plantation, there and creating that. And we've also working on a parallel program in the same area where we are creating biopellets out of the waste, and which is again furnished to companies and to use as alternate fuel. So that's what we do in CSR projects, where we're looking at both the biodiversity and we're looking at some tangible incomes or some tangible outputs that we are creating, and this really helps us fuel and get more projects off the feet. But the challenge remains. Unfortunately, rules also allow us to be in a particular project for a set number of years, and 3 years and 4 years is not sufficient time for us to actually see tangible outcomes when you're working in complicated areas such as this. So the complexity of the issue is something which is always a challenge for us. If I'm looking at it from a bank perspective, then yes, the bank, as you know, we are working on various climate associated risks and opportunities. You'd have seen in the annual report, we are looking at climate risk modeling. In fact, I think the bank is one of the only, if I may say, that's actually looked at climate risk agnostic of any particular sector. So we've done a sector agnostic climate risk modeling, and the results are out. So I think all of this is something that really propels us and makes us look at it more positively. In the long run, this is something that is inevitable, irrespective of whether, how easy it is to work on this, but this is recognized as a priority for the bank, and we've got a strategy worked out for that.
So I have 2 points. So it is very important for us to ask, what is Axis Bank doing to drive climate action, such as reducing its carbon footprint, so promoting green finance?
No, thank you. I think it's very, very important. In my last response, I spoke a lot about risks. Now I want to speak a bit more on the opportunities. And I think ultimately our aim is to really weave the opportunities and really extract the opportunities. Like I said, ultimately banks do not lend in vacuum, or banks do not do business in vacuum. They work with the real economy, they work with stakeholders like you. all of you have bank accounts, for example. So the aim to really is to really move with the rest of the economy and try to build those opportunities, create those opportunities, like you said, what the bank is doing. So green finance is important. I think for me, one is green finance. Typically, though, it has been commanded by renewable energy, by solar, but I think I'm happy to see that it's now shifting. India started to work on its climate taxonomy, for example, and that hopefully will open a lot more opportunities. Green hydrogen has come, and these are all investable opportunities that So these are all investable opportunities that we constantly work with our customers also. And I think an important aspect where I personally, in my role, also want to drive is a greater engagement with our client base. We work with a wide range of customers, right from your women SNGs to the largest conglomerates in the world, and to the SME, to the very important, critically important SME sector. And these are the sectors which are going to be extremely, one is they're the most vulnerable to climate change, so they need to be protected and they need to move themselves. Agri space, for example, and these are massive sectors for the banking sector also. So I think that's where the opportunity is for banks also to really move the needle and nudge them. I think the big challenge we face generally is to make a business case. So when you preach about climate change to an SME owner, it's really not in their mind share, because they're more focused on working capital and honestly just meeting with their compliances, for example. So how do you drive this conversation? It takes time, and importantly, it takes also collaboration. So for example, now you have SIDBI and NABARD, etc., working a lot more closely with the banks. There's a lot more engagement of the RBI with the banking sector around climate risk, around climate opportunities. SEBI is moving, the previous question you asked, I did answer about data, for example. All of these ultimately move to help improve our decision making and understanding of our surroundings and really. So I think that's what, it's a journey, but it has to be done. Again, the challenge or the uniqueness about this whole area is it's very, very dynamic. Things keep changing on the ground. You mentioned about water, for example, is changing now. How do you explain to your, say, to someone on the ground that there are floods? Everyone knows there are floods. But when you start putting two and two together, why are there floods every year, for example? Really, that's really the shift that you also have to engage with the internally. So other change we are making internally is a lot more internal conversation. So luckily we have an ESG committee at the board, and that's really allowed us to bring a lot of these stakeholders internally, especially the ones who are perhaps the most critical or they're not aligned. When you speak to a business person, they want to do business. When you tell them that there's certain things you cannot do, or you have to do more than your peer or your competition, then there's a lot of resistance. So breaking those internal resistances and getting the internal buy-in also becomes very important.
Thank you for this insightful lecture. I'll kind of wrap up with respect to a small example. So there's a commodity called black art, and it is close to $1 billion commodity. And more than 80% used to come from a small tiny place called Sikkim. And suddenly climate change happened, and majority of the produce was not, they were not able to produce, like the replenished. And second, block cave. So two big activities which they were not responsible for impacted the whole livelihood of multiple farmers in that side. So keeping that in mind, we need to find some alternate ways how to preserve and conserve these types of things. At the same time, we have such an amazing panel here. So if people have any questions, open to take that, and happy to have the panelists answer. Anybody in the audience? Any questions? Yeah,
Hello everyone, thank you for this opportunity. I am a master's student from Tata Institute of Social Sciences. My question is to everyone, we all are trying to bring many technologies which is trying to make change. But none of those technologies, we have so many CSR departments from all the companies, but none of those technologies are into mainstream. If we still go out there, you will still see that same plastic bottle, same plastic wrappers, which is actually making the change in the world. Plastic is one of the biggest pollution, but there's no change in it from the past so many decades. So how do we change it? or what are the companies doing for changing all those things?
So I'll try answering that. So I'll try answering that. I think if you ask me what is it that and how things will change, I think change begins with oneself, right? Whether it is you, it is your staff or your organization. But if I'm looking at it from an HDFC Bank perspective, very small, but I'll tell you that we have tried to make our offices plastic free. So we don't use plastic bottles because you spoke about plastic bottles. I think people who are slightly more aware like us, each of us try to influence others. That's where the change begins. The answer is not as simple as what I've propagated. I know and I recognize that, but I think we've traversed a long way from where indiscriminate plastic was used to where we are now. There's a long journey that needs to be done, but I think collaboration is the only way forward. You also spoke about technology, but integrating technology into various initiatives that one does, whether it's plastic, and I can say that we've got 2 plastic recycling units in Assam that we are supporting. I think initiatives like this, taking responsibility both for the usage and for the recycling by larger corporates who have a presence here is something that would definitely contribute to the problem, if not solve it completely.
Dhruva Chaudhary, I'd like to follow up on the question and put it directly to Shashi, right? The reason I say that is, despite all that you say, despite all that we have been, preaching for what we can do, the food industry still uses the largest in terms of packaging. Even if I want to change, I don't want to use plastic, right? Where is my choice when I go to the shop to buy simple things like dal? It's still packaged in plastic. So what are corporates like Unilever doing to change that?
I think the question people keep asking me every time, and I think the question everyone relates to. So let me categorize plastic into 2 definitions. One is technically recyclable. So the way it is layered, so you will have PE, BOPP, there will be many layers. So there will be multi-material and multi-layer. So that is a format which cannot be recycled. Then there is monomaterial, multi-layer, which can be recycled. So this is a definition of a technically recyclable product. And then there are formats which do pick. So if you look at collection, the PET bottles and everything which is, there is a definition called rigids in the Plastic Waste Management Act by the government. There is rigid, there is flexible, and so on. So rigids get collected almost 100%. You will not find a PET bottle lying there, a rag picker will pick it up because it has value. But flexibles is the most difficult to collect. Then there is consumer habit of cutting the top somewhere, throwing it up, creating microplastic. The whole habit change which we need for consumers not to buy products which are in plastic, as rightly said, needs to happen, and we are at an infancy stage today. 90% of the people don't care even though they talk about it. So what does Unilever do, or all corporates which are producing plastic, is they have to first reduce virgin plastic use, because that is where the entire footprint comes in. The second part is making the entire packaging 100% reusable, recyclable, compostable, and that is where we are also going. The third part is collecting more than what you produce. That is where the EPR laws come in. And this is where Unilever leads the way. Advocacy, one of the questions which Anuj was talking about. We work with the government on EPR laws. If you look at our sachets portfolio, etc., we are 100% recycled. Is the industry there? The rest of the competitors not. So that is where the whole part is, that some corporates will try to take a lead in trying to move to 100% technically recyclable product. Industry will not move. Is the consumer ready to pay a premium? That is where the entire understanding comes in. So, having said that, it is our moral responsibility to understand that we are also part of the problem, and that is where we need to become a part of the solution. And that is where, in my first response, I was saying, we look at waste in India not just generated by us. So that is where the first part of responsible consumer education happens. The second part, working with waste workers, giving them job identity, dignity of labor, etc. happens. And the third thing is the entire material recovery facilities which Nusrat was talking about. And that you need a one at exponential scale. You can't have 10 tons or 5 tons per day facilities. You need facilities which do 250, 300 tons per day. Because in a city you're generating 3,000 to 5,000 tons in a city. So if you put infrastructure which can foster collection and then bring it to these places, that is how you will prevent the waste reaching landfill. And that is what we strive in the entire value chain. Just the last submission is the entire concept of waste to wealth. The amount of waste we generate is wealth for the entire ecosystem. More waste we generate, the government spends more to clear it. And it will never get cleared because there is a value to it. So that is where we also need to look at how we generate waste. I hope I answered some part of the question.
To wrap up, we have a panelist here later part of the day as well. So thank you everybody, and look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you to this remarkable panel for shedding light on how integrating ESG principles can turn natural assets into the cornerstone for a prosperous, sustainable future for all.